Being stuck in traffic on a bridge would make anyone go mad. That is, if you had a place to go, or if you were welcome wherever you were headed. That wasn't the case for Brad, who's been living in the back of his van for the past 2 years now. He's been taking whatever party gigs he can get as a miserable fucking clown until he can scrounge up enough money for his next drug bender. Then, when he was done blowing his money on blow and prostitutes, he'd just change his stage name in his ads for some new clientele. A sad man portraying a happy clown driving his sad-ass van around just like every other day in the city. Except that today was his son's birthday, and he was going to pay his son an unexpected visit. Figured his boy would enjoy seeing his pops since it's been a while and he could sure use the money. Cheryl usually throws money at him just to get him the hell away from her. Still cares enough to keep her new officer husband from throwing him in jail. Brad took a small baggie out from under his novelty balding clown wig and sprinkled some coke on the steering wheel. He gave it a riff, leaving some residue under his big red nose. He wiped his nose, then dipped his middle finger into the small baggie and held the outside with his thumb. Brad reached over into the duffel bag in the passenger seat and pulled out a flask. Traffic was moving again, and the car behind him honked at Brad, who was unscrewing the flask with one hand. He rolled down his window to flip off the car behind him, screaming, "Fuck you, bitch! Oh, fuck!" Realizing he had catapulted the rest of his coke out the window. Brad continued cursing to himself while wiping what was left on his finger on his gums and chugging what was left in his flask. Traffic came to a sudden halt, making Brad slam on his brakes. It's going to be a long fucking day. Brad arrived at his ex-wife's house and parked down the street. He sat there until he knew his son, Cheryl, and her dipshit husband were inside. He reminisced about the time when that was his house and his family, while he sat in his own head, only to be reminded about what he lost when her damn husband pulled up with the cake for his kid. "Piece of shit," said Brad. He stepped out of his van and closed the door in the iconic clown getup with his face painted and all. Brad stepped in the direction towards the house before reaching into his striped baggy pants and pulling out his Glock. He pondered for a moment. I don't need it. And threw it back in his van, then headed to his old home. As soon as he stepped up to the door, Cheryl's sister opened it with music and kids blaring in the background before he had a chance to reach for the handle. Her face quickly went from a smile to a scowl as soon as she heard his stupid voice. "Why, hello there, Brad was cut off by his favorite ex-sister-in-law. He stuck his big red shoe in the door to keep her from closing it on him and pissing her off in the process. "Back the fuck up, Brad, and get the fuck away from my sister and her family. You smell like shit and look like shit. And that kid doesn't need to see his piece of shit dad on his birthday, especially like this." Brad smiled and looked to the side to spit in Cheryl's flowers sitting next to the door. "Dad?" asked Brad's kid, standing next to his aunt. Brad crouched down to be at his level and put on the biggest smile he could, then brought a finger to his lips to shush him. Brad then booped him on the nose as he used his weight to push open the door while its guardian was moved to the side. He made an entrance, yelling, "Hello all! It is I, Babbles the Clown!" The kid ran back to the party, calling for his mother in excitement, with his aunt right next to him in a panic while all the kids flooded to the door. Brad immediately started his act in the family room as parents and children gathered around. Brad crouched down and gestured to his son to come by his side. "Well, well, well. Looks like it's the little man's birthday, isn't it? How old are you today?" Cheryl's husband scoffed before yelling out, 12, if you actually paid attention to your kid. Cheryl threw him an elbow, but she knew the damage was already done. Brad stood up with his smile turning into a frown and yelled back, well, if I wasn't fucked out of a family, I would be around more often. You think about that, Mr. Perfect? Cheryl stood between her husband and Brad, trying to de-escalate the situation, while her sister and the rest of the parents gathered up the kids. Then it began to rain inside. It was a wetless rain that touched everything, but left nothing. Nothing but change. First thing Brad noticed was Cheryl's husband had started to grin while he yelled at him, and Cheryl started smiling herself. This made Brad yell even louder while holding his little boy closer to him. Second was the panicking screams coming from the dining room. Brad watched as Cheryl's husband laughed and laughed while his body started to lose form. He slowly sunk to the ground, laughing hysterically into a pile of clothed, boneless flesh, with his lungs struggling to get air for one last chuckle. Cheryl was at his side, scooping up his slack skin as it fell from her hands like mucus onto the ground, with her laughing and crying all at the same time. Brad's son was shaking in terror, so once he broke from his trance, he crouched down to comfort his boy. He held him close and told him, "Don't worry, boy. I'll keep you safe. Let's get the fuck out of here." All while he watched his ex-wife hold onto her ribs and fall face first into what her husband had come to be. Brad held his son in front of him to look into his eyes, then gave him a kiss on his forehead for reassurance as his son started chuckling himself. His boy held his hand to his mouth, trying to contain the laughter, but it only made him laugh more. Brad shook his head, crying. What the fuck? Please! Not you too! As his boy fell to the floor, crying from the uncontrollable laughter, just like the other two. Brad picked up his son, who was still laughing, and began making his way to the door, when an explosion came from the other room. Brad was thrown through the front door and onto the lawn with his son's body rolling into the street in a fit of laughter and pain. Brad looked up to see that it was still raining, but the ground wasn't wet, and each household was dealing with its own troubles. People were running out of the majority of the houses on the block, screaming. Some looked normal, while others were on fire. Some had extra limbs and even took flight. Most of the houses were either in shambles or cratered as if something had vaporized the area. When the fog cleared and Brad could finally move, he was too late. The neighbors across the street backed out of their driveway in a hurry and ran over Brad's son. They peeled out of the area, plowing through anyone in their way. The now tattered clown got up and ran over to his son, crying, and paced next to his body with his hands on his head, pleading for help. One of the neighbors who had seen what had happened ran to his aid. Brad looked at him with teary eyes, crying, "Please save my boy." But the man looked at him and broke out into a fit of laughter and fell beside them, holding onto his ribs like everyone else, right before turning into a pink mist. Brad was tossed on his ass as a gust of wind blew past him and showered him in the neighbor's blood. "What the fuck was that? Oh God, no!" Brad screamed when his eyes fell back on his boy. It looked like someone had stepped on his son and smeared the center of his torso into the asphalt below. Brad scurried to his feet and made his way to his van, scrambling for his keys before he finally got the door open. He kicked off his massive red shoes, started it up, and stomped the pedal to the floor. The rain phased through his van and himself without leaving any sort of residue. He made it out of the residential area and into the city with the radio blaring.
It seems that the sunken city of...
Before he clicked off his radio, the van came to a slow stop behind a mess of vehicles in a tourist area of the city. What the fuck? He looked around to see people running into buildings and lightning blowing out the windows behind them. There was even a group of looters that all looked exactly alike and grabbing everything they could as they ran through the streets. A man who had hands covering his entire body slammed against Brad's window, startling him and screaming for help in a muffled plea. Brad kicked away from the door to the passenger seat while all the hands groped at his window. The clown cried in fear as his hand landed on his Glock that fell in his bag when he tossed it earlier that day. He brought it around, then fired 2 rounds into where the man's head would be if he was normal, and it dropped to the ground. Fuck this, Brad said, stuffing his flask in his duffel bag and jumping out of his van. Everyone around him was in chaos while he made his way down the street. Not only did the gun make him feel confident, but he was still running the white slopes. Brad ran into the first, least hectic shop he came across. He ran in as a clown covered in blood and debris, wielding a firearm, screaming, "Give me all your fucking money!" But there was no one listening. He checked behind the counter to see an empty register, then proceeded to go up to the living area above, like he was the only one that had that idea. He came to the staircase to see a mess of blood and sizzling guts splayed across the walls, with black lines burned into them. The smell was putrid enough to make him vomit in his mouth. The clown made his way up the stairs with his firearm ready while doing his best to step over the viscera. He came to the top of the stairs that were covered in flesh, to a door that was burned through. There was a woman crouched over a puddle of water on the other side that was sobbing uncontrollably. The floor creaked under his foot, and she turned her head, showing glowing eyes. Brad quickly put one in her head, and those eyes went dim as her body went limp. Brad scoured the living room of the small housing area above, stuffing anything that looked of value in his duffel bag. He snatched a bottle from the counter and threw it back until he couldn't drink anymore, and that's when he heard knocking coming from one of the bedroom doors. Brad stopped moving altogether to see if he was hearing things and heard 3 more knocks followed by a small voice.
Hello? Is anyone out there? My parents locked me in my room and I can't get out.
He slowly placed the bottle on the floor, then crept in the direction of the door, trying not to make any sound. The kid kept calling out.
Hello? Oh God, I hope they didn't leave. Hello?
Brad's mind was racing with all the possibilities as he whispered to himself while approaching the door. What in the fuck? What in the fuck? What in the fuck? What in the fuck? He placed his ear against the door, making his goofy hair smush up against it. And a loud bang came from the other side, making him retract back. Fingers started poking out from under the door that only reached so high, and twisted around like tendrils. Brad aimed his firearm at the door and pressed against the wall to get to his feet while shaking. The thing on the other side screamed,
"I can taste you! I know you're there! Open the door and let me out!"
One of the fingers touched a spider on the wall next to the door, and it immediately turned into a small puddle of water. Shortly after, a long tongue slithered from under the door and slapped its tongue on the small puddle. Brad shakily fired 2 shots into the door, where assumed that thing laid. One of its fingers twitched, so he let off another round just to be safe. The sad clown was shaky with his face paint bleeding down his face and still covered in blood, trying to figure out his next move. I gotta find a church and some fucking drugs. he said to himself out loud, as if it was the best idea to come to mind. Brad ran into the living room to grab his duffel bag and the bottle of liquor he left on the floor. He ran to the stairs and slipped on the mess of what was left of the other intruders. The clown landed halfway down the stairs on his back and slid the rest of the way down. Brad stood up once he caught his breath again, now holding a broken liquor bottle, saying, "Son of a bitch!" Outside the store, the clown ran, covered in blood, while holding a Glock in one hand and a broken bottle in the other. Everyone who passed by, abnormal or not, burst into a fit of laughter if they made eye contact with him and ran off laughing until they could no more. This all happened while he screamed, "What the fuck is going on? What the fuck is so funny?" But no one gave him an answer. It just drew more attention and caused more laughter. He ran down the street waving his gun and broken bottle at whoever was in his way. The now mad clown had seen a church down an adjacent street that he remembered also acted as an orphanage, and his frown turned back into a smile. "Oh, thank God. Please get these demons away from me, and I promise I'll never touch a drop of booze again. I'll even stop doing drugs altogether." Brad cried. He ran and ran, but the closer he got, the more his smile turned back upside down. The door was frozen with ice stalagmites protruding outwards. "The door is fucking frozen? Are you fucking kidding me? Fucking Mr. Freeze stopped by or something?" Brad threw the liquor bottle at the door and ran around to the park in the back. He stopped there and jabbed at his head with his Glock out of frustration, trying to think of his next move. He sat down at a bench and went to run his hands through his hair, but stopped when he realized he had had that stupid wig on. He ripped it from his head and threw it to the ground. "Excuse me, sir. Can you help me and my pastor? He can't see," spoke a child that was approaching him. Brad looked over to the kid and smiled. The kid looked back at his pastor, giggling. "I told you he was nice. He's just a clown." Brad jumped for joy and hugged the kid, yelling, I'm so happy to see you're okay." The kid burst into laughter as if he was trying to hold it in, crying. I just can't help it. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be rude." Brad slowly broke into a laughter of his own as they both laughed together.